coming to Work in Progress series. I would like to remind you that Work in Progress talks are co-organized by American Councils, CEERES, and Eurasian. And today's presenter is John Graham from Princeton University, and the topic, as you say, is the last master Georgian Orthodoxy and the oral chant tradition. So, without a long introduction, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's very good to see you. I'd like to thank the American Councils and the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus for hosting this series and inviting me to speak here today. I also want to thank a few individuals who have helped me find these unique sources and help me study these sources, especially Recording of Artem, and Kondakion. So I'll just begin the talk, and we have a number of slides, a couple of audio recordings, and basically I'm going to be talking about one particular figure in history, Artem Erkomaishvili, who was, you can guess from the title, the last master of the Georgian Orthodox liturgical music oral tradition. Throughout history, the collective knowledge of communities and societies has formed an essential part of the social fabric of human civilization. Evolutionary anthropologists suggest that the creation and maintenance of belief systems, rituals, and collective arts, such as dance and music, created the basis for the evolution of advanced societies and cooperative groups. It is posited that the successful transmission of these critical beliefs, told through stories and enacted on calendrical cycles of festivals, ensured that groups were better prepared to deal with catastrophe and to explain fundamental questions such as mortality. The importance of oral histories and the cultural transmission of collective art forms has not been lost on those seeking to consolidate and homogenize ethnic and national identities. Such oral traditions as the King Arthur tales, for example, in Great Britain, have been elevated to national cultural status, while other traditions, such as the folk musics of the disparate ethnic groups of Anatolia, were suppressed in the early 20th century in favor of a homogenizing national Turkish folklore. In Georgia, literal and oral histories have long overlapped. Epic poems such as the Vepis Tbilisi, or Night in the Panther's Skin, were written and have been passed down in written form as an important material object of traditional dowries, while at the same time, local poets were valued for their ability to recite from memory large sections of the poem. Bardic bagpipers in Georgia traveled the country up until the end of the 19th century, recounting historical tales and humorous ballads, a lyric poetic tradition that was never written down and has since been lost. The traditional music of Georgia existed almost entirely in the realm of oral transmission, both the folk and liturgical repertories, through the end of the 19th century. This is remarkable, considering that the liturgical chanting tradition in Europe transitioned from a completely oral tradition to a written tradition nearly 1,000 years ago. Scholars debate how much overlap occurred in Europe between the oral and literate musical traditions, but most agree that by the 14th century, the technology of music notation had supplanted almost all oral transmission. Students of chant, therefore, use the written source as the infallible source, rather than their teacher's oral history, an attitude we maintain in most regards to this day. But the situation was very different in Georgia. While written music notation existed beginning in the 10th century, it never supplanted the tradition of master-to-student transmission and thrived until the end of the 19th century. That such a tradition thrived this long makes the study of the Georgian oral tradition an important case study for understanding other liturgical oral traditions which have long since vanished. Add into the equation the sheer number of chants memorized in three-voice polyphonic complexity, and the study takes on the air of a masterclass with a trio of truly great musicians. The importance of studying oral traditions is both practical and scholastic. As the post-Soviet revival of the Georgian Orthodox Church elevates the importance of traditional chant, it is important for singers to understand the difference between musical parameters introduced from Russia and the West versus musical parameters such as tuning, text setting, intonation, harmonization, and improvisation that come from the Georgian traditional oral transmission. This is from the practical side, from the singers. From a musicological perspective, which is often dominated by the study of written source materials, studies of oral traditions are becoming increasingly important to understand aspects of musical performance that cannot be captured in written notational systems. Knowledge gained through apprenticeship to master chanters was far more comprehensive than notation can be, which may be why the Georgian liturgical chant tradition and other musical traditions continue to be transmitted orally despite the availability of notation systems since the medieval period. There are two drawbacks to oral transmission. The first is that it relies heavily on individuals and individual memory, which requires a lifetime of practice that is only possible in specialized societies where designated authorities could be supported by the larger community, in the Georgian case, the Orthodox Church. The second drawback is that oral transmission depends on the interest of new generations of students. As both of these prerequisites broke down in 19th century Georgia, the liturgical tradition in Georgia began to decline. Now, as I get to my main theme of the talk today, which concerns Artem Erkomaishvili, as I said, the last master, I'd like to paint a small window frame, if you will, and bring a glimpse into a particular moment in history. The moment is 1947, and the setting is a village in Guria, Black Sea region, as all of you know. Erkomaishvili, the most famous traditional singer in the region, had just died at the age of 100 years old. The whole village turned out for his funeral, and a trio of Gigo's musical students, longtime members of his choir, Dmitry Patarava, Vadim Simonishvili, and his eldest son, Artem, stood next to the open coffin and sang the entire traditional music funerary service of polyphonic chants from memory. This is according to a book written by Artem's grandson, Anzor, who was present at the funeral himself as a young boy. He says, "The whole village was stunned, as this ritual had not been seen since the Bolsheviks came to power. Only the elderly remembered it." End quote. This shows us that the beginning of the Bolshevik period signaled a complete suppression of traditional chant, such that in the villages, far from the centers of cultural suppression and cultural control, which you could argue was Tbilisi and then later regional cities throughout Georgia, perhaps Ozurgeti and Guria, even that far into a village, the suppression was that complete that the villagers had not heard it since 1921. They hadn't heard this funerary chants for 26 years. Allow me to play a recording by one of the singers that I just described. This recording was made in the Tbilisi Conservatory in 1966 by Artem Erkomaishvili, 19 years after the funeral of his father, and just a year before he himself died at the age of 80. recording raises a number of questions, both broadly, such as what musical tradition does this represent, or why is this important to study today? And more specifically, such as who was the singer and why is he singing by himself? The latter question is easiest to answer. Artem's two compatriots, Varlam Simonishvili and Dmitry Paparava, had since passed away in the 1950s, leaving no one else alive who could remember or perform these hymns in their three-voice context. Remember, this recording I just played was 1966. The first question concerning the Orthodox liturgical singing phenomenon at large and understanding the reasons for its decline and the eventual demise of the oral tradition with the death of Artem in 1967 requires a broader discussion. This talk, as it unfolds, will make use of rarely seen sources from Artem's personal archive, including audio, video, and written musical notation, in order to convey the depth of his musical knowledge and to stress the unique possibilities that these sources offer for understanding how oral transmission of complex liturgical music systems operated in other cultures around the globe. So now I'll just speak ad lib a little bit. This is the Shemdzlebel monastery where Artem learned to chant, where his father, Ego, was also a chanter. It's in Buria. These monasteries were supported by aristocrats, such as the Burian nobles. This is a typical aristocratic family. They were from Buria. As young men, as boys, in fact, they were sent by their families to study in the monasteries. And one of the main subjects that they would study was the traditional liturgical chant. So, though they are aristocrats and leaders of the armies and generals, perhaps, they were also master chanters, many of them, the aristocrats. They were also patrons of the monasteries and therefore helped create the system, the economic system which supported the master chanting art, so that teachers could work full-time as chanters and not necessarily subsistence farmers. The grandfather of chant, so to speak, as far as we know from oral history of the Shemdzlebel monastery, which is the chant tradition that Artem inherited, was this gentleman, Georgi Dumbadze. You can see he was born in the 18th century. He was the uncle of Anton Dumbadze and the grandfather of David Dumbadze, who died in 1918. These two are important figures in the transcription movement. When Pilimon Koridze, who was an opera singer, came back from Italy to Tbilisi, he started transcribing chants in the modern Western five-line staff notation. And Pilimon Koridze went out to Ozurgeti and worked with these two, as well as some of their chanting friends, to transcribe a lot of the chant that we have today and that's being sung in the churches in Tbilisi. Some of Anton's other students included, as you can see, Melchizedek Nakashidze on the left, who was the direct teacher of Artem Erkomaishvili, who I introduced at the beginning of the talk. Also, we have Nestor Kondakion and Varlam Simonishvili, who was one of the singers in 1947 at the funeral. Here you can see Artem's father's choir in Buria. In 1907, they would have been as proficient at chants as they were in folk songs. By the 1930s, when they were forbidden to sing chants, the younger generations in this choir knew folk songs, but not chants. Only the older members, such as Artem himself, would know the chant tradition. And that's one reason that without any new students learning this oral tradition, we can say that it died when Artem died. Some of their friends were these two cousins by the Chavleishvili. The trio was called the Chavleishvili Trio, and the English Gramophone Company recorded a number of folk songs in Georgia in 1907 and 1909 in order to sell the gramophone machines. They were trying to have a business, so they recorded whatever they thought, the music that they thought people would purchase the machines. Good thing for us, while they were recording folk songs, at the end of a couple of the wax cylinder reels, there are a couple of snippets of chants. Not complete chants, unfortunately, and I think there are only 2 or 3 such recordings, but they form the basis for our knowledge of pre-Bolshevik chanting, how it occurred, what it sounded like, things that we can't get from the transcriptions, like tuning and breathing and tempo and all kinds of performance practice. So you can see that they're recording here, and we can actually hear that recording now. It's a priceless recording. I know some of you here at Chanters, you'll agree with me that this gives us, as modern chanters, trying to revive this tradition in the Orthodox Church, gives us a lot of information about how these singers were performing together without notation. These singers didn't know how to read Western notation. They knew all this music through oral memory. Okay, I want to transition now to the next section. Actually, it looks like we have a few more photos. Okay, here's Artem and his 2 brothers, 1913. Artem in the 1920s. Here's his father. Already you can see what an old man he is. He lived another 13 years. Here's the Erkomaishvili choir in the 1950s, and the reason I put this photo of the slideshow is to show you how choirs are changing. In the Soviet period now you have bigger choirs, you have co-ed, there's certain homogenization or standardization of costume, and likewise of the music. Okay, now I want to transition a little bit to talk about some of the sources that we have from Artem's collection. And you'll forgive me if I read another little section as we look at this. Like all of the early Christian chant traditions, the liturgical music for the Orthodox liturgy in Georgia was learned and recited by memory. It was transmitted from generation to generation in the important monasteries of the region, where young people, mostly sons of aristocrats and clergy, would study with the masters of their day. Our access to the pedagogical processes of oral transmission remain vague, and that's why we must look at the available written and audio sources on their own terms, but also with an eye towards understanding what these sources reveal about the underlying oral tradition in which they were created. Neume notation, such as we see in this document here, survives in several Georgian manuscripts from the period of the 19th century, but is still relatively indecipherable to scholars today. This is because these manuscripts are witness to the earliest stages of notation, when signs were infrequent and described only general direction and duration of melodies. Singers clearly still relied on their oral training to perform the liturgy. In the 9th and 10th centuries, in the Middle Ages, music notation began to coexist with the oral chant traditions throughout the Byzantine and Latin Christian worlds, a response to the explosion of new chant texts written between the 7th and 10th centuries. Prescripted notation, that which precisely indicates pitch and rhythm, could be used by singers who didn't already know the melody, was developed in Italy and France in the 12th century with the so-called Heideggers, and in Greece with the 12th century Poisson notations. But these innovations did not reach Georgia, which by the early 13th century had lost ties with Byzantium in the wake of repeated devastating Mongol invasions. The presence of notation in Georgian manuscripts, therefore, is limited to the period preceding those invasions, and scholars assume that the oral traditions persisted. because references to chant beginning in the early 18th century speak of a vibrant chant tradition and reference various styles in the politically disjunct principalities of Georgia. So, in the pre-12th century notational system, the notation described melodies that chanters already knew by heart. Only after the 12th century, a new type of technology and notation comes about, whereby chanters that didn't know a melody could read notation and sing it, the way that we assume notation works today. But that was an important innovation in the 12th and 13th centuries that didn't come to Georgia. In Europe, the rapid advancement of notational methods gradually eclipsed the need for the oral memorization of the chant repertoire, which gradually faded away as the last masters died. Scholars debate the length of the oral and written overlap of these sources, but safe to say that learning from manuscripts dominated the Catholic chant world by the 13th and 14th centuries, leaving many questions about the parameters and nuances of the formal oral transmission process in Europe unknown. In Georgia, on the other hand, oral transmission continued through the Middle Ages. Notation re-emerges in the late 18th century, bearing some resemblance to the medieval notation system, but not matching it completely. So let's look at some more examples. This is a page out of Artem's personal chant book where he wrote down texts, and he put small music notation signs above the text to indicate to himself where the melody moves and how many notes to put on each syllable. It's difficult for us to understand exactly his system. And thankfully, we can do a little bit of comparative analysis. For example, we have the same text here 3 times in his sources. And I've lined them up just to show that there are several things we can do when we compare these 3 versions of his text. For example, we can see that the musical signs are very similar. Therefore, he was singing the same chant as we would expect. However, they're not exact, which indicates that either the new system that he was writing with, he had it personally codified, as in this symbol means exactly this, or more likely, he was singing different versions of the same melody, which is common in the oral tradition in Georgian chant. It was semi-improvised, so they would sing different variants to the same melody, and therefore these neumes might indicate slight differences. For example, if you look at this syllable here, you have a cup and a dot. Here we have a dot / 2 cups. Here we have 2 dots. So this is a place where apparently there is a possible variation in the melody. Or if you look at this word dot, it has a number of symbols above it, but they're quite different between the 3 variants. Okay. This summarizes some of the points that I just brought up. The main point to gather is that there was a vast oral tradition, which these symbols are just painting the surface of. There was a vast knowledge of chants, and we know precisely that Artem knew 2,500 chants by heart. So this one that we're looking at is one of those 2,500. Now, by comparison, we're looking here at a medieval manuscript with neume notation. We know precisely that it was written in these dates, 978 to 988. Just to get a little close-up, it's maybe difficult to see, but the text is in black, and the red symbols above and below the text are music symbols. However, they occur much more infrequently than in the 18th and 19th century texts. They hold a certain consistency to themselves, but like I said earlier, these symbols don't necessarily tell us exactly what melodies were being sung. They just tell us that there was an active musical tradition which these symbols represented. A little bit of history about these manuscripts that were being created in the 10th century. This, of course, was the beginning of the Golden Age in Georgia. There was a big revival, both politically and religiously at the time. Chant texts were being written. There were many new chant texts for the Orthodox liturgy in Greece, and these were being translated by Georgian monks in Palestine, Mount Sinai, and especially in this period on the peninsula of Mount Athos near Thessaloniki, Greece. These new texts were coming to the region of Tbilisi. All of you know, as specialists in Georgia, this was a region that was very important during this period for the revival of Georgian culture and political autonomy in the region. From here, in these important monasteries in the Tbilisi region, chant went up into central Georgia, as far as we can tell, to the Gelati Monastery, which then became the capital. It's just outside Tbilisi. It was the important capital for David the Builder in the 11th and 12th centuries. And from there, chant spread to eastern Georgia and also down to the Shemdzlebel Vart monastery in Guria, which we saw earlier was the seat of Artem's chant system. Now, it's important to mention here that chant already existed in all of Georgia since the 4th century when St. Nino proselytized here. However, we don't know the precise characteristics of that chant. We don't have any written documents about the music notation, and the only thing we can do is speculate on its precise nature, whether it was three-part polyphony, whether it was monophony, whether Syriac and Byzantine chant. It's unclear, and that's a scholarly debate that continues now. Most scholars of Georgian chant agree that by this period, 10th, 11th, 12th century, Georgian chant was in its current form, or an early stage of its current form, which is three-part polyphony. Gelati Monastery, which is known to have been one of the important seats for the teaching of Georgian chant, as well as other scholastic subjects in the Middle Ages. Okay, now back to some of the sources that we have in this later period. This is the earliest, earliest manuscript in this later period bearing neumed notation. So after the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, we don't have any manuscripts for about 500 years with musical notation. This one from the late 18th century is the first. It comes from eastern Georgia. And we can see that it bears some differences to the medieval notation. For example, you can see there are new types of symbols. There are cups, there are lines, dips, and multiple lines, hash marks together. Here's a manuscript from the Shemdzlebel Monastery in the next century with a similar array of different kinds of symbols. Excuse the blurriness. Again, the Shemdzlebel Monastery. Now, a new type of notation also comes in this period, which is the not just the symbolic graphic signs above and below the text, but also the insertion of phonemes. For example, this text we have here, I put here in Latin letters, Nateli, Siqvarulman. Now you have ya, not part of the original text, but inserted vowels. And you can see that in the notation itself, sometimes vowels are inserted below. So where before there were discrete symbols to represent musical melodies, now they're inserting vowels. Extra I's here. And from Artem's book, which is the latest of, which is basically the last source that we have with this kind of a descendant of medieval neumed notation. This was created at the same time that chants were being notated in 5-line staff notation, so it's a very interesting source for us because we have transcriptions and we have audio recordings of Artem's music, and we also have his personal book with all of his neumed notation. Here we have free comparison again. All right, next I want to talk a little bit about some of the other interesting facets of Artem's personal sources, his personal chant book. This was a notebook that he recorded texts in, but he also has he has lists, like a list of songs that he was to perform for a radio concert and other things as well. We can see the evidence of the Soviet suppression in this book, in fact. So, for example, in this chant, which I have in the English translation here, in the text in Erkomaishvili's book, we have some slight differences, some things that he's changed. So, as you can see there, underlined. Instead of "O glory of mother, the eye of virgins," it's "the eye of Georgians." Now, this is a kind of a change that needed to be made in the Soviet period for obvious reasons. Instead of we cannot utter praise worthy of you, your nativity. Nativity was taken out so that it would just be praiseworthy of you. And finally, at the end, instead of with belief we praise you, O Mother of God, here it's we praise you, the glory of Georgia, so that it ends on a kind of a nationalist tone. So there's just little details here that tell us something about the environment in which Artem had to perform this music that he well knew the traditional texts, because his teachers were lifelong master chanters, as was he. And yet, under the pressures of the Soviet system, he needed to change the text. Now we'll look at this page on the right, which is a list, a concert list. Now, some of the songs here are very Soviet. For example, My Little Georgian, May 1st, The Proud Homeland, etc. These are songs that some of you may know. Here's the last master chanter. He knows thousands of liturgical chants, but he was not allowed to sing those. Instead, he was forced to sing this type of repertory. He is able to put in a couple of traditional folk songs from Guria. He also puts in a song here that he himself wrote. It's listed here as Three Revelers, but in fact the title is We Lost Three Revelers. It's kind of a memorial to three singers from his father's generation. And the penultimate song here is the one I want to talk a little bit more about. It says Nino's Galova, or Nino's Chant. The proper title would be Saint Nino's Kondakion, but the words Tsminda and Kondakion would not have been permissible in this period, so he just calls it Nino's Chant. So elsewhere, he has the full chant written out with his neumed notation. And we can see that in the chant text here, he has written out the correct liturgical text. Let us sing praises to the apostle chosen by Christ. Christus Sagan in the middle word. But we actually have a recording of this chant as sung by Artem with his grandson Anzor and their friend Badri from 1960. And in the recording from 1960, you'll hear that they needed to change Christus Sagan to Chavli Sagan, changing the actual meaning to let us sing praises to the apostle chosen by the people. So let's hear that. Now, remarkably, a video of Artem has surfaced where he's singing with his two younger brothers, Kondakion and Nino. And this is a remarkable source because Artem is the bridge, he's the last. He represents the oral tradition, which as far as we can tell, started in Tao Projeti in the 9th and 10th centuries and persisted for 1,000 years. And here he is. He was able, among some of these concerts, to sneak in a chant or two, as we can see, by changing the text. But still, it gives us a glimpse of what the oral tradition might have been like. Let's just watch this. Or even in audio recordings. For example, from their posture we can tell that they did not even have to look at one another. They relied entirely on their ears to sing together. No one conducts the chant, indicating that important elements of group singing such as cutoffs, entrances, pace changes, the placement of consonants at the ends of syllables, and other features have either been agreed upon in advance or are intuited through acute listening and familiarity with singing. From a performative standpoint, the existence of an audio or video recording is far superior to a notated transcription because it comes closest to studying face-to-face with a master chanter. We can observe elements such as breathing, whether or not there is a long breath taken at the end of a phrase to signal a point of medial closure, or a short breath that bridges energy generated from the previous phrase into the subsequent phrase. To truly appreciate the oral tradition, we would need dozens of videos of Artem singing this chant in all of its variants and telling stories about the contexts of the singing, the rules, the attitudes that one has as a singer towards the chant, and other musical nuances that informed its performance. Alas, we only have this one video. The other four songs that were performed here were folk songs, so just this one video of a chant. However, the next year, conservatory professor brought Artem to the conservatory just down the street, where he recorded 100 chants by himself, singing the first voice, then the second voice, then the third voice. And as I said earlier in the lecture, that was because no one else alive knew those chants by heart. Anadia and Ladiko were excellent singers, and in fact, choir directors themselves. Yet, in their youth, they had not apprenticed with master chanters to learn the full system of chants, texts and melodies and harmonization in three voices. So, while they are good singers, we wouldn't call them master chanters. They may have known, I'm just hazarding a guess, 20, 30, maybe 50 chants by heart. The difference is that Artem knew 2,500. He knew systematically how the chant, the melodies, and harmonizations work together. So, in the next year, he had to sing all of these rare chant texts by himself. He was 79 years old when he recorded them. He was the only one that knew the repertoire, as I said. When he died the next year, the knowledge of hundreds of chants was lost. More importantly, the nuances of performing chant in the oral tradition were lost. This is the largest and most important audio archive that we have. Let's listen to one of those recordings that I put the three voices together. As I said, they were recorded one at a time, but here we can hear Artem singing all three voices. Erkomaishvili, the last master of the Georgian liturgical chant oral tradition. What we have situation today in the post-Soviet space, the liturgical chant, of course, is no longer suppressed and is in fact in revival. There are a number of choirs throughout the country that sing Artem's chants. They've been transcribed and published, but we, as a generation of singers, I would say, we're more of a literate learning community. That is, we read chants from notation. We read them like we would read a book. We may memorize them, but it's the way that one would memorize a poem or a Shakespeare play. The difference is that Artem learned and had knowledge in an oral context. He knew the parameters, the rules within which he could improvise, within which he was a creator, and that's a big difference. And that's something that the current community of chanters is aspiring to, but we're still in the process. So that's why I think I can say confidently the chant tradition as an oral tradition died when he died, but there's potential for it to revive. It just takes a lot of work because reading a literate text is easier than learning the parameters for reciting an epic poem, for example. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you for coming, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
say there's a community of people who are working on this, but how many people today in Georgia or around the world do you think are focusing on trying to recover this lost body of work?
That's a good question. Thank you. Well, there are several fronts moving forward. There's a scholarly community, an active scholarly community. So every couple of years, there's a new dissertation, for example, being written at the conservatory. There are every 2 years there's a conference on traditional polyphony that includes both Georgian folk and sacred music. And I would say there's an active debate among the Georgian scholars on these themes. It's a small community, but it's active. On the performance front, since the Patriarch gave the blessing for all choirs in the Orthodox Church in the year 2000 to sing traditional chant, more and more choirs are trying to live up to that blessing and perform traditional chant. It's available in publications. There are about 8 or 9 books of traditional chant that have been published. And having been in the archives and seen all of the transcriptions, I can tell you that the published chants that exist are only about 10 or 15% of what actually exists. So there's still a lot more to be published. But the main chants for the liturgy, for the Vespers and Matin services are all available in choirs of many. Numbers of choirs that sing only traditional chant, I could only hazard a guess. It could be 100 around the country. Most of them in Tbilisi, but many parish churches around the country as well. Internationally, the Orthodox churches abroad, for example, the Orthodox Church of America, is interested in singing Georgian melodies the same way they're interested in singing Serbian, Russian, Greek, etc. So they're interested in all Orthodox music, and they typically want to sing it in English. So there's kind of a movement to translate texts, or take English translated texts and set them to Georgian musical melodies. International scholar circles, there's really not much happening yet. So, there's people that are interested in folk music, and there are performers of sacred music, but there are very few people that study Georgian liturgical music thus far.
I have 2 questions, if I may. So, from your pictures, it looks like women joined those choirs only during the Soviet times, and probably it's because of those songs were mostly sung before in monasteries or churches, so that kind of limited the women's performance in them. But how did women, participate? What was their position in those chorus? Were they adequate to men, or were they more just backups for men singing? And my second question is, while researching this topic, you probably could not avoid the toasting culture in Georgia. So maybe you could just give a very short overview if you are familiar with any kind of toasting culture, and how did it change historically in terms of this, singing and toasting together.
Okay, very good questions. Thank you. To the first question, as far as scholars in Georgia say, the master chanter tradition, that is, students that would apprentice at a young age for 5 or 6 years in order to learn the complete system and graduate. This was exclusively the role of boys and men. However, there is a lot of evidence that say in convents, nuns chanted the liturgy. So it's entirely not just possible, but probable that there were women who sang a lot of these chants. Perhaps not the most ornamental chants, but then certainly they knew the liturgy. The current situation in Georgia, I would say there are more women chanters, and you guys can agree or disagree with me, the chanters here. I would say there are more women chanting in churches than there are men. In Tbilisi, there are a number of male choirs, but you go outside into the regions, and there are a number of women's choirs. So in the current Orthodox Church, there's no gender specification about who's allowed or who's not allowed. However, I will say that the music itself as a three-part harmony music in close harmony, so it's not spread out in range like Western chant. Makes it easier for a single gender choir to sing together. 3 men, 2 with high voices, and some others with low voices, or 2 women with high voices, some women with low voices. When there are mixed choirs, which there are, for example, I was just out in Gilati Monastery the other day, and there's a mixed choir there, men and women that sing. The men are forced to sing high in their range, and the women are forced to sing low in their range so that they can maintain this close harmony. It's a little awkward for everyone involved, but entirely possible. In folk music, the situation is a lot different. Of course, there are entire genres that were sung by women, and there are entire genres sung by men, and there are other genres that were sung together. The picture that I showed with men and women together at Erkomaishvili's choir from the 1950s, they were singing folk music, not sacred music. So that's one thing to keep in mind, since it was the mid-Soviet era. Okay, to answer your second question about the toasting tradition, I don't know the full history of the toasting tradition. What I can say as it relates to chant is that, especially in this region in Goryeo, the supra, the feast, was always started with a chant. Maybe not just one, maybe 2, 3. We even know which chants they would always start with. For example, Ver Shemdzlebel Vart was a famous chant that would start the feast. Other songs were Glory to our gathering. Today the Lord has gathered us. And other chants were sung to start the feast, and later, after the wine was flowing, folk songs would be sung. So the toasting tradition and the feast, the supra feast, was often seen as a sort of folk parallel to the liturgy. Chants were sung, the bread was broken, wine was served, and toasts were made to all of the most important themes in local life. The toasts would commemorate weddings, they would commemorate funerals, they would commemorate any particular feast day or someone's individual birthday, and all of these occasions were accompanied by music. Great question.
Yeah, to what extent can you rely on other existing traditions outside of Georgia to reconstruct some of these oral traditions that almost died out, basically, here?
That's a great question. What we can learn from other oral traditions is methodology. How people studied other oral traditions, and how does that inform how we can study this oral tradition? We can look at parallel analogies, do comparative work. So for example, people agree that Gregorian chant, the chant of the Catholic Church, was an oral tradition. And it overlapped the manuscripts for a couple of centuries, probably 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. By the 12th, 13th century, oral tradition was dying out in favor of the manuscripts, as I talked about. So scholars of Gregorian chant debate those overlaps and those influences. They take different manuscripts and they compare them, and they look at the differences in a particular chant, and they say, this deviation is because it shows us that it was, in this area there was still an oral tradition, whereas in this area we can see that this manuscript is an exact copy of a previous manuscript, therefore it's already a literate tradition. And there's a lot of guesswork about that oral tradition in the West and how it proceeded and how it influenced other regions. There were, of course, Rome and Milan, and there was Spain and different regions in Europe who had different oral traditions, which were supplanted by the literate tradition. What's great is that in Georgia, this oral tradition persisted up until modern history. We have transcriptions, we have audio, we even have this video. If Gregorian chant scholars had these sources, there would be a lot less guesswork and a lot less, perhaps, speculative books and dissertations on what the oral tradition may have looked like 1,000 years ago in the West. Here we have this opportunity to say, here's an active, complete oral tradition for the complete liturgy and thousands of chants, and we can look at individuals and say, how did they memorize this? And what role did memorization play in the role of the church? So how we study it, the main methodology that I use to reconstruct the oral tradition, since we don't have any music treatises that tell us exactly, is through comparative music analysis. I'll take 3 chant texts, as you saw, and I'll line them up together, see their differences. Or I'll take transcriptions of Western staff notation, look at their differences, look at their similarities, and that will show us which notes they varied and which they didn't. The notes that they did not vary, which are consistent, show us that that was important for the oral tradition. Notes that do vary between chant variations show us that those were superlative. They were variations. They were ornamentation for something that was more fundamental. So I have a chapter on that topic that's growing religion. Others?
So would you say that it's the case that with the end of the oral tradition that the space for improvisation in chant nowadays has also disappeared? And then another question, what's the role of monastic institutions in
What's the role of
monastic institutions in revival chant in Georgia?
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so improvisation is precisely an indicator of oral tradition. And we're not talking Charlie Parker improvisations. There are strict rules, there are strict parameters on how to improvise. Nevertheless, chanters and folk singers, and they were usually the same people, would pride themselves on never singing the same way twice. And people valued their music when they would do something subtly different each time. So this is an important parameter for the oral tradition. And it's something that still exists in folk music to some extent, but in chant is relatively non-existent. If we have some chanters here, so at the very end, if we do a chant, we can show you a little bit how one might improvise. Little tiny variations and things like that, but by and large, I'm a chanter myself. When I memorize a chant, I'm memorizing from a book. And I might memorize a couple of variations from a recording or from another book, but I'm not existing in an oral tradition where I learn from by ear certain systems, and then within that I can improvise. I think that's coming now. There are chanters in Georgia, certainly, who know chant to such a level that they can improvise freely. But they're few. It's not widespread. And your second question was about the role of monasticism in Georgia today. That's also a subject that I'm very interested in because, of course, chant used to thrive in the monasteries where they had the most services per day. The chanters were the best because they were singing 3-4 services every day, whereas in parish churches, services tended to be shorter and were only Saturdays and Sundays and great feast days. So, chant thrived traditionally in the monasteries. However, as we know, in the Soviet period, everyone was killed or exiled from all monasteries. And now the chant tradition is being revived, mostly in Tbilisi, mostly by trained musicians. So the Antiskati Church Choir, who are the leaders of the chant revival movement, most of their members are conservatory graduates. The former director is a jazz pianist on the side. So these people are trained musicians and they read notation, they understand music theory, they understand Bach, they understand jazz. So it's a different way of approaching the chant tradition. My generation, Soso-Yo's generation, aren't necessarily trained musicians as in conservatory, but still, they read notation and come from an educated background and so forth and so on. Now what we're seeing is that chant is coming out of Tbilisi and back to the monasteries, and it's a process that's happening right now. I travel quite often in Georgia to monasteries, and everywhere I go I chant. And usually there's 1, maybe 2 chanters, and now there's a few monasteries where they have at least 3, the prerequisite number that you need, or maybe more. But still, it's a process that's happening slowly. Bodbe convent, Santaro convent, they have enough nuns that chant that they require. Men's monasteries, the new one, Daryal Gorge on the Russian border, they have enough chanters to chant. But in Gelati Monastery, Varzian Monastery, they only have 1 or 2. So the monks themselves don't chant. They have people that come in from outside and do services. Maybe one more question, and I'll let you go.
Will you do a chant?
What?
Will you do a chant?
Where do I chant?
Will you do it? Perform.
I chant in the Kashwati church across from Parliament.
Will you perform one now?
When do we perform?
No,
Will you do
it
one?
Like now.
Would you perform now? He's asking
Oh,
you.
will we chant now?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, let's finish with that, if there are no more questions. Air TV go, what? Go. These are my good buddies, Guido and Soso from the Sakhyoba ensemble. We'll sing that chant that's often sung at the beginning of the CEERES in Guria.
Example here too, one of the examples by Artem.
No, this is Tbilisi.
Oh.
Yeah. And it's the text is specifically for Palm Sunday, but we sing it other times of the year too. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.